On the day-to-day, we make charts and graphs for the newsroom. And as an illustrator, I've also experimented with adding illustration to my work, whether it be through combining it with DataViz or reporting and drawing my own comics for news. I use they, them pronouns, and I have my contact information up on this slide. I also have a link for a copy of the slides on here if anyone would prefer to follow along rather than watch me screen share here. It's totally up to you all. But yeah, let's get started. So here's a general kind of overview of what I'll be talking about. I'm covering a couple of different areas, so to condense things, I've tried to organize each section by pulling out takeaways. For DataViz, I'll talk about a little bit about what the team I'm on does, and I'll talk about the approach that we take to making graphics for news. And then for illustration and comics, I'll talk a little bit more about what I found to be like their uses and strengths. So to get started, NPR News Apps. Who are we? What do we do? Gonna go over first the sort of a sampling of the kind of work that we do. So first off, most of the work that I do and other folks on my team do on the day-to-day are quick return charts for npr.org, the website. This is like our bread and butter. Here's like a sampling of a couple different charts I've made recently. Generally, reporters or editors, how it works is they'll come to us with requests and say like, hey, you know, I'm working on a story about this. Maybe I found some data that I think could add helpful context, or, you know, I think, can you help me with figuring out how to best present something? And these are generally have like a quicker turnaround with a timeline from anywhere from like a day or two. Say like, hey, I need a chart of this by the end of the day. Or most of the time, I would say on average, stuff will take us like a week from start to finish to put out. And here's a couple examples of recent work. One of them is a table, I think, what is it? Listing the status of different anti-trans sports bills for a reporter working on a story about that. Moving on, we also do election results. Notably, we worked on displaying election results for the 2020 presidential election. This includes building a live graphics to display live updating results, like maps, tables, different analysis graphics for specific stories, as well as the different primaries throughout the year. And right now, we are working on some stuff for the midterms. We also build tools for our reporters to use in terms of like live blogging, election updates. Another area is building and maintaining trackers for ongoing stories. So notably, the biggest thing that has been taking up our time in this arena is our various COVID trackers. We've been steadily building, redesigning, and maintaining several different trackers for COVID figures for probably, I mean, it's been a couple years now at this point, but we maintain separate trackers for US numbers, world figures, vaccine doses, as well as I think there's a hospital capacity one. And to some degree, this has positioned us as newsroom experts in COVID data, as well as on the right is like another tracker that I've been maintaining with our investigations team. They wanted to track the different charges stemming from the January 6th insurrection. So that is another thing that I've been updating weekly for the past couple years. These are larger projects that tend to take more collaboration and more thought as to, like, over time maintenance and thinking about like what to change, how to update these with changing data. Yeah. Another area that we work in is we make a lot of maps. So this includes locator maps. We've been making a lot of maps about Ukraine recently, demographic maps. The one on the right is one that my colleague Nick made, I believe, showing demographics in Alabama for a story about is a map that I made a couple years ago tracking cat movements in a specific neighborhood for a study about basically like the roaming habits of domestic cats who live outdoors. So just a wide variety of things based on what the news is. We also work on larger interactive projects. These are a couple of screenshots of examples of that. What this means is that these projects exist outside of our regular story pages on the website, and they allow for more experimental design and interactive elements. So one of these that we published recently on the top left was a memorial project that we worked with our music team to showcase the songs that meant a lot to folks that passed away from COVID. And you can scroll through and listen to the songs as you read through obituaries that their loved ones submitted. Yeah, so generally like bigger projects like this. And finally, when we have time, we try to do some original reporting. So for me, that tends to be either data reporting, comics, writing, any combination of those. Like I like to try and focus on stuff about either pop culture or identity, but have done, I think, a large number of COVID-related pieces as well. Those are some of the comics that are up here. Yeah, that's a general overview. We do a lot, as you can tell, on a small team for a major newsroom. We're small, we're trying our best. As a comparison, like on the left, here's a screenshot of the credits on the New York Times COVID tracker. You can see they have a lot of folks working around the clock to help them keep that updated. And then here's the credits on ours. So a big difference. So that means that we have to be realistic about what we can do and refine our processes so that we can quickly churn out graphics and figure out what to prioritize. Moving on. In terms of like a short introduction about me, NPR was my first job out of college. I started as an intern in 2019, so not too long ago, on the same team that I'm on now. And I guess they liked me enough that I still work there now. Got hired full time about a year ago. I studied journalism in undergrad, but I also studied computer science and art. I was trained as a traditional artist, but I taught myself how to do digital illustration. So I think the combination of all of these things have like led to where I am now as like a visual graphics reporter, and I guess trying to figure out what is the best way to use different combinations of these different skills, which I'll be going over a little bit. So yeah, that's basically the intro. And I think now I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the approach that our team takes to making graphics. So sort of to sum off at the top, in terms of like, I think if you had to answer the question of like, what do we think makes a good viz? I think over time, I've found that the answer on our end tends to really boil down to like asking the right questions, making sure to make space for reflection during your design process. And what I mean by that is like, for our team and the way that we work, we're often not the ones that are the experts. So we have to be smart about asking the right questions at the right times. We usually have to get up to speed on new topics very quickly, in a way that like doesn't necessarily mean that we have time to go out and like fact check people necessarily. We do some amount of like fact checking the data that like reporters or editors will bring to us, but oftentimes they are the specific experts. So the process really relies on like asking them for context. And so how this like relates to the overall process that we do is like, we can then become the audience surrogate and design around that need, meaning that a lot of our design process tends to be centered around users and asking questions like, who are our readers and what might their needs be? Like, what is the key thing we want people to know? What is maybe the best way to convey that? I think many times people will come to us with both what they want to show and an idea of how they want it displayed, but maybe there's not always a connection between the two. I think it can be tempting for many folks to approach us with the perspective of like, oh, I just want to show my data, or I just want to make a cool thing with what I have. But I think a helpful way of framing the conversation that we try to do is saying like, oh, like what is the main takeaway you want readers to get from the graphic? Sort of, you know, maybe a sentence, just like one sentence, like a story headline. And this informs how we visualize the data and how we refine it later while editing. So maybe later on we've made it and we're like, actually, what I've made doesn't answer this question, so we'll need to change it. And I think that applies for us as well. I think sometimes on our end, it's easy to get carried away, and that like sometimes the bad ideas that people bring to us are really interesting design or technical challenges. Like, wow, someone's brought me this really interesting data set that like has a lot of interesting edge cases. I feel like this will be an interesting challenge to make it into a map. But then it's like, well, let's back up. Maybe that isn't actually the best way to show this. So I can talk about a couple examples instead of just rambling. This is an example of a COVID risk map that's currently on our US tracker. We made it, I think we made this a couple years ago at this point, but we're still updating it. So when we conceptualized this at first, we started with what questions we thought a reader might be asking. So in this case, it was, where am I in this? Or like, how bad are things in my area? I believe this was when one of the main conversations was about like COVID hotspots. So what's going on in here is like, we have a couple elements that we started with. We had COVID case data as well as this risk level scale, based on a scale that some folks at Harvard developed. So once we had those elements, I think we thought like, what in terms of context, what might readers need? So if we're talking about where am I in this, well, we can compare risk level on the state level. And then for additional context, maybe we can also explain what the different risk levels mean, both qualitatively and quantitatively. These specific thresholds versus what they indicate. So like, you can tell somebody that yellow means 1 to 9 daily new cases per 100,000 people, but like, honestly, even if you told me that today, having worked with this, I'd be like, all right, well, what does that mean to some degree for me personally? So we workshop some language about like, oh, this indicates potential community spread versus close to containment. We're also using per capita rates rather than the raw number of cases to normalize the comparisons. Otherwise, the superpopulated states will almost always rank highest if you do raw data. But that will just tell you where people live, not necessarily where the outbreak is having the greatest impact. And we're also using 7-day averages because daily case data for COVID tends to be super noisy, a lot of peaks and dips. In terms of additional context, we can also give more information on the highest risk places. If readers are concerned, say like, oh, you're like, wow, I'm in Wyoming. Why is it red? Like, maybe I want to know more. So we can show if those numbers are trending worse or if they're trending better lately. So a lot of this graphic came about from asking like questions like that. Another example here is this is a chart that we did during the 2020 election that I made that was pretty user focused and that it was designed to answer a couple questions we thought readers might have. The key question being like, this was right when everybody was like, oh, how many votes are left to be counted? When will they be counted? What do these numbers mean? You know, I think you can show this question in a number of ways, but we thought making a series of waffle charts would let people easily compare vote totals without doing too many mental gymnastics. And the way we structured this is to kind of step through these different comparisons. So first, these are currently the current uncounted votes. Here is the lead in these states. So you can see like how narrow the lead is and like compared to like how many uncounted votes there are. And then for context, we added a third element to compare how close the winning margins were in 2016. You know, otherwise you can say, well, there's this many uncounted votes in Georgia. But if you say that, oh, you know, in this state, they actually won by this many votes in 2016. Well, oh, okay, that number actually means a lot then, like it's pretty significant. Yeah, and specifically for this one, like I think readers really like this graphic for the clarity. I put a tweet up on the right of somebody saying that they liked this graphic a lot more than what the New York Times had put out. It's like kind of hard to see the comparison, but that's like the New York Times remaining votes tracker on the right, which is, you know, I think it perhaps gets at the over time comparison a little bit better, but I think it's a little bit hard to, you have to like think a little bit about what those lines mean. And I don't know that it's super clear like what numbers mean in that case. Yeah, another kind of aspect that we try to use for our graphics is thinking about like doing user testing when we can. So when we think about all these questions that readers have, sometimes you don't actually know the answers to these questions unless you start asking people. So here's a diagram of the process of user testing, which is, it's generally a technique used in the design process more for like digital products or product design in general, where the life cycle is research something, design it, test it with users, and then iterate back on the design. But we found that it's super helpful for us on larger projects where we have the time to ask for feedback from more people. I am usually the one in charge of organizing and running user testing for our larger projects. And what we usually do is gather a diverse set of volunteers from NPR to read through a project and listen to their feedback and ask questions. And this is separate from our usual editing process where editors and stakeholders will offer feedback. And we found that it's like really invaluable for larger projects because you just can't, especially when you've been immersed in something for a while, even for us when we're coming to things, like you're not omniscient. This is an example of some user testing results from the Songs of Remembrance project that I talked about. I guess it's sort of hard to, I highlighted in red the design changes that we end up making, and they're kind of small, but basically via user testing, we got feedback that like the different kinds of audio we were using in this project were confusing to readers because we hadn't adequately communicated via the design that there was a difference in what they were listening to. Is basically the gist of like what's on the screen right now. So I think in terms of like applying this to our day-to-day graphics, like we don't always do this like intensive testing, but sometimes if I have more time, I'll ask like somebody I trust from outside the editing process for feedback. Like sometimes that means my mom a lot of the time. And I think just like the gist of this is like trying to gather more data to make informed choices. Like we try to use analytics on our larger projects. And what we found from there is that most people are reading our projects on their phone. So we really need to value how something looks on mobile. And less people fully engage with interactive elements in our graphics than we'd like. So that helps us think about like what to prioritize. Another kind of philosophy, so to speak, that I think we ask a lot of questions around is like harm reduction or threat modeling. What this means is that as journalists with quite a large platform, we feel like we have a responsibility to vet the stuff that we put out into the world. So this includes asking every time questions like, how could something be misinterpreted or misrepresented? How do we convey information in a way that builds confidence with our readers? What biases might we be feeding into? And if it's an ongoing story, like with things that might change, how can we responsibly plan to communicate that? So a good example of this, because I mean, I think we go through this process with most of our graphics, but like a really great example of this is election results. I will say with the caveat that I did not work directly on this elections rig that I'm talking about here, but the conversations that folks were having around this were like team conversations. And if you want to learn more, one of my colleagues wrote a detailed article on this process. But basically during the 2020 election, our team, we knew that the election, like in advance, would be prone to stuff like delayed counts, so much misinformation, hyper-focus on certain races. So even before they started designing, some of our elections folks spent time brainstorming the cleanest way to display these and results and to prevent them from being misinterpreted. So thinking of different ways things could go wrong, essentially, like legal challenges in multiple states. What happens if results are like super unclear? What happens if potential violence breaks out because of the way that election results are interpreted? And that kind of gets at the threat modeling side of things. But in terms of like harm reduction, one thing that they focused on was to avoid small early leads causing unnecessary concern or drama. They ended up tweaking how results were displayed, and what this means was that like I feel like this is an issue that often comes up in election results, where it's like journalists spend a lot of time talking about like, oh, early results are not necessarily trustworthy or representative because they come from rural precincts, they tend to lean Republican, they don't include the majority of the population of the state. And a lot of times the effort there goes into like, we have to tell readers that early results aren't fully representative. And to some degree, like this is important, but like also when you're building results, it's like you have to like, it's not maybe just an education problem then, it's like you have to, that has to factor into how we're building these results too. So what we did was on every single chart, they set a super high threshold. So we said, oh, only when 50% of vote counts are in reporting will we begin to shade a candidate as leading across every single graph. Otherwise, like, what is the point of putting the information out there if it's untrustworthy? And to reinforce that we expected delayed vote counts, we also stuck an explainer note at the top of the page to flag that, you know, if results are delayed, it's not a problem with the vote. It's just the situation at hand. Yeah, so I think that gets into like conveying information in a way that builds trust with folks, because if like you can do all the educating that you want ahead of time, but if your results, if you don't model for that within your design, it's like, and show like untrustworthy numbers, like does like putting stuff out in the world that is untrustworthy maybe increase, does that increase unnecessary drama? Does it stoke distrust in readers when your graphics change rapidly without explanation? I'm thinking here about like, if any of you all have seen the famous needle that the New York Times loves to use. But yeah, so this was like a lot of thinking that went into our elections graphics. All right, that was a lot at once. But now I'm gonna try and shift topics into sort of the intersection of illustration and data viz. As an illustrator, I've tried to figure out ways to combine the two. Here are like some takeaways that I found with the caveat that like it's still an area I'm exploring. I'm generally the only one on my team that tries to combine these two fields, so always open to tips, especially from folks here too, if you have thoughts. One thing that I found illustrations to be super useful is that they can help humanize charts. So this is one of the most basic examples. So what I've got here is, here's an example of two charts we've got that are basically the same. The left one is by CNN. The right one is one that I made for an article that I wrote. During API Heritage Month, I had an editor ask me to do a data-focused story debunking the model minority myth. Unfortunately, CNN put out a very similar story right before us, but it resulted in this very interesting comparison that I can show y'all, in that we both essentially made the same graphic comparing different subgroups of Asian Americans in America. But I think, you know, the one strength of DataViz, which is like the ability to show, you know, it's great because you can show patterns by aggregating large data sets. It can sometimes feel maybe sterile when you're, especially when you're trying to represent people. And especially in the cases when you're trying to represent like the deaths of folks or something like that. I don't know. I make a lot of charts where I turn people into boxes, and that can feel dehumanizing to some degree. But I think illustration can often bring back that emotional weight that DataViz sometimes lacks. I mean, specifically for this one, this is like a pretty basic example. I used images of people instead of the boxes, but I think it does help give a bit more life to this graphic. And another use case that I found for illustrations and graphics is that they can, sometimes data needs additional visual context to make sense to readers. This is an example of a graphic that I made for a project with some of our climate folks, where we made a guide to hurricane risk for folks. Originally, we just started with this map of potential storm surge flooding levels in North Carolina. And, you know, we were sort of going through the edit process and thinking about like, well, if I was a reader, what additional context might I need, or what questions might I have? And like one thought that I had was like, well, you know, if I lived in New Bern and you told me that I might get like 6 feet of flooding, I don't actually like, I don't know, personally, my spatial recognition is not that good. I don't actually know how much that means in terms of like my dwelling. So we thought we'd turn the legend into like an illustrated set of houses to show like how tall like certain measurements are, to give readers a sense of like, well, if there's 3 feet of water, this is how it might impact your living situation. So that's one case. This is another example. This was a graphic that I made for an opinion piece from Code Switch, which is a podcast that from NPR about race and identity. Great podcast. You should listen to it if you don't. But the reporter wanted to write about different versions of the Karen archetype throughout history. And one of the questions that came up was like, well, we don't necessarily have a definitive visual of a Karen for each generation that we're talking about here. And so I was like, well, okay, we can talk about what characteristics each Karen might look like, and I can just draw them. And this can maybe help clarify what we're talking about here. So that's what we did. We spent some time researching, looking through archival photos and different media from each generation, thinking about like what might each archetype look like and be associated with. So yeah, and I think that's the end of, yep, that's it for examples there. I think finally I'm going to end on talking about comics. I know we've gone through a wide range of things, but to end with, I'll talk about maybe my favorite thing in here. I have a very special love in my heart for comics. This is an area that I'm very glad I've had the opportunity to explore in recent years, in terms of combining reporting and illustration. So here's, I guess, some takeaways I found of like ways that strengths and uses for comics and news specifically. We found that like comics specifically are really great for communicating complicated or emotional topics. You know, they can lend a sense of humor to a serious topic, or lend a sense of nuance in space for really hard emotions. I think, like we talked about before, occasionally DataViz, or maybe just like news in general, can sometimes feel sterile at times. I think a great benefit of comics is that they can offer a great deal more visual space, flexibility for some nuance. So one example of what I'm talking about is this. This is some screenshots from a comic that I wrote about a year ago about how I personally was struggling with feeling numb about COVID numbers. This was probably a year into like updating our COVID graphics like every single day. And I think I was grappling specifically with a kind of frustration with how, in some senses, personally, I felt like the DataViz that we were making on some level had failed to properly convey the weight of the tragedy we were going through. And so I ended up turning to comics as a medium to like explore this feeling. And I think I think this was like the ideal medium to convey like the story, because with the visual space, you have space to sit with different emotions. I could visually draw out and convey a sense of the numbness I was feeling. I played with colors a little bit as a visual shorthand for emotions. So as the comic begins, I talk about how I'm starting to feel numb, and then the colors start to leach out from the comic as like things start to feel worse and worse. I start to interview some experts about the psychology behind psychic numbness. I talk about what I do to combat it, and like the colors start to come back in. And I think this also is like a very visual story, because it is about like what images, the power of images to elicit emotion. And so I think like this way I was able to illustrate examples of things that did or didn't work, like charts, specific photos from humanitarian tragedies, things like that. So yeah, I think, like I said, comics are also a great vehicle for visual metaphors or personal stories. So an example for this one is, this was a comic I made with our census reporter, Hansi Wong. He kind of came to us like, hey, I want to visualize and explain to people this like topic of congressional reapportionment. But you know, with the understanding that it's a complicated topic, and also B, a little bit boring. So we said, okay, well, let's come up with like a visual metaphor to explain this to make it more interesting. And he came up with the concept of using a relay race to visualize the handoff of data from different folks. And I said, well, we can make it more fun by turning everyone in this story into a cat. So that's what we did. And I think, you know, that way it's making a complicated topic more accessible to folks that originally might not be like, I'm not interested in learning about this obscure process that like determines how your representatives are calculated. Another example is, these are some excerpts from a comic that I did recently with an NPR podcast called Life Kit. Their whole thing is that they offer tips for people to improve certain situations in their life. So this one, I worked with a reporter about, the story was about how to pay attention to familiar surroundings. So maybe you zone out of your commute every day and you don't actually stop to like sit down, observe the areas that you live in, maybe have more appreciation. So for this one, I think a comic was a great way to convey the tips that they were trying to get across. If you can tell, there's not actually that much writing in each panel, but like the images are kind of conveying their own weight in terms of information. Like the tip is like one sentence, like focus on observing a certain aspect of a space. And so then I talked to Andrew, the reporter, and was like, well, if you had to implement this, like how would you like to implement this tip? And he was like, well, I'm a radio guy, so I'd want to just go into Baltimore and like listen to the sounds on the street. And I was like, all right, like send me a picture of yourself. Let's illustrate this scenario of you doing this and what you would hear. Yeah. I think like one big benefit that I've learned from making comics is that they do really, really well on social media. They get a lot of engagement that way, to the point where I will often just tailor all my comics specifically for social media. in a way, like you format them in a way where they will fit in like, say, 10 slides on an Instagram carousel, or they will fit in the Twitter thread, or like they'll be easily tapped through on an Instagram story. I think because of how accessible they can feel and how, like, you know, you can pull out like large chunks of it into an Instagram post. Like we've noticed that like comics consistently will have a higher rate of engagement on social media, plus people reposting it. The example here is of a comic that I made about some cats talking about ways to get around COVID misinformation. This one got reshared a lot on social media. I made this a couple years ago, and I still occasionally get questions of like, can I share this with my account? Can I use this with my kids as like a lesson about how to talk about this? So I think that's like a huge benefit of comics. I feel like the one caveat I'm always giving about comics to editors especially, and I don't know if this is necessarily relevant to you all, but just that they take time to make compared to graphics. As an example here, I've included Slack messages from the beginning and end of the process for my COVID numbness comic. If you look at the timestamps, you'll see that it took almost exactly 1 month. And for us, this is like slow because we work on a news schedule where it's like, let's get something out today or tomorrow. But yeah, I don't know. I think comics generally take a bit more time in terms of you have to write a script first, then you have to edit the script, then there's drawing, editing the drawings, editing the interplay between drawings and texts, figuring out writing the alt text and making sure they're accessible to folks. It usually takes about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on what else we've got on our plates. Yeah, I'd figure I'd throw that out there because I am frequently making this point to editors. And yeah, I believe that's it in terms of my slides. Sorry if I went a little bit fast. I was trying to make sure it's not taking up too much time, but that's it. And let me know, that's my contact information. So feel free to reach out to me now in the Q&A or after for any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Connie, for the presentation. If you're able to, let's all unmute and give Connie a virtual and chaotic round of applause. 1, 2, 3. That's always fun to do. That was super interesting, Connie, and every time I feel like I had a question in my head, you followed up with an explanation or an example like right away. So thanks for being so informative. I think you've given us a lot to think about in terms of new ways of reaching broader audiences or making some of our products more accessible to diverse audiences as we communicate, our data or findings. And there are already questions from the community, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started with today's Q&A. And again, folks, you can type your questions into the Teams chat, or you can use Slido and ask questions anonymously, or you can raise your hand to ask out loud here in the meeting and we'll call on you to unmute. In terms of Slido, the most upvoted question was, what tools do you use to make your DataVizes?
Oh, sure, I can talk about that. That was actually a slide I was considering including, but ended up scrapping because I didn't want to take too long. But yeah, I can talk about that. Generally, our team, we use an open source graphics rig that we've put together. I think you can look up, we've written blogs about how to use it before, and it's totally open source. If you, I think, just try to Google like NPR News Apps graphics rig or some combination of those keywords, you probably find what I'm talking about. But yeah, it's a lightweight rig that basically has a number of templates for different use cases of graphics that we use a lot. So like we've got a bar chart template, line chart template, got different map templates, and that allows us to like make graphics super quickly. So say if someone wants a bar chart, we don't have to build a bar chart from scratch every time. And all of these graphics are done built in D3, which is a JavaScript visualization library that I'm sure maybe some of you have heard of. So yeah, most of the time we generally work in D3/JavaScript. For stuff like maps and things that take more of an illustrative approach, we'll use Illustrator, and you will use a script that the New York Times developed called AI to HTML to port Illustrator files into HTML code. So I think most of the tools that we use are like either the rig that we have built and maintained, or like sort of free tools beyond the Adobe suite. Like what I mean by free tools is like trying to remember. We use QGIS, however you say it, for a lot of our mapping. And we'll generally use whatever each person is comfortable with for data analysis, like Python, Excel. Most of our like light data analysis is done in Google Sheets, just because it's like really easy to share with other folks and collaborate using that. Yeah, I think that's hopefully a general overview of this universe.
For sure, and you are right. It was the first thing that popped up when you Google NPR graphics rig. Thanks.
Great.
Very accessible. The next question was how, and I think you talked about this a bit for sure, but how do you communicate uncertainty in data sets?
Yeah, I think sometimes like, it's a case by case basis, but I think sometimes it includes like, I think this goes back to like kind of what like takeaway you're trying to provide for readers, and if like if that takeaway in question is like, for example, for election results, basically people want to know who's won a certain election, and I think when there's uncertainty in that question, like sometimes it's a case of like, well, I think it's often a question of like, do we communicate this uncertainty very, very explicitly, like footnote everything, add text that says like, watch out for this data is only current to this date, things like that. Or it can be a question of like, does this actually mean I need to like omit certain things from the graphic to make it more clear, like we did with election results, in terms of like, well, if it turns out that like we didn't do the thing with displaying election results past a certain threshold, if we're having to do like this amount of explaining, this amount of education for readers, then it becomes like like this should be probably something that gets addressed in the design of the thing as well. Like maybe at that point we don't even show the uncertainty to a certain point. Like we try to build barriers around it. And I think for election results specifically, like also trying to anticipate different scenarios that could come up, I think was helpful. And like building in certain safe checks into our graphics at times, to be like, well, like talking about things ahead of time, being like, well, if this thing happens, we won't update, and we'll try and wait it out until maybe the data is more clear, because it's better to have slightly outdated data versus something that's very confusing this is like a question that we run into very often with our COVID graphics when like, well, you know, it turns out Florida just hasn't updated their COVID numbers in like 2 weeks. So like, rather than having to over-explain that, it's like, well, maybe we can just kind of like omit the display for Florida for like a day or two, and like it's probably fine. So I think like calculating like the balance of like what feels worth it or not. I don't know if that was a helpful answer, but just going through some of that thought process.
Yeah, no, definitely helpful. It's interesting to hear again, like an external perspective as opposed to our scientific workflows in the USGS and some of our policies and publishing processes. So I'm going to switch to the chat really quick. There's a question here that says, is clearly effective to represent a more vulnerable, emotional, and personal point of view by adding illustrations in comics? My question is, do you find the critique and feedback process for work with illustrations to also feel more vulnerable, or possibly that people approach critiquing the illustrative work differently than they do with more quote unquote objective graphics like squares, maps, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think it is like in the same way that like I think there are certain editors I work with that are a lot better at knowing how to edit like graphics versus like straight news articles. Like there are editors that I've worked with that are like seem to get much more like that are just essentially like better at editing comics. I think it is like a different perspective to take in terms of like, it's a little bit harder sometimes to measure. Like with DataViz, it's like, well, you're trying to measure like, does this accurately show a pattern maybe? But for illustrations, it can sometimes be a little bit more vague. Like, are you accurately conveying some kind of emotion here that you want to convey? And I think that can be a different kind of thought process to work through, as well as like, I think often the editing process for comics gets into trickier questions around representation. Like, are you accurately representing what you are drawing? Like, are you making sure that like something we do every time is like, are we accurately representing the experts that I'm illustrating in comics? Like, so I'll have them send me like a photograph and I'll ask them, how do you prefer to be illustrated? Or it's like, if you're drawing like a crowd scene, like, are you making sure people are diverse? And stuff like that. I think to your question about like vulnerability, especially when you're working on like personal stories, like my COVID comic, I think it does often feel more vulnerable. For that one specifically, it was like very much me working through my own emotions. So like figuring out, getting critiques on like how to best represent that, I think at times did feel difficult. But I don't know. I feel grateful to my editor for, I think he offered some really great feedback at times of like, this isn't effective. Like, let's reorganize here.
Awesome. And did NPR had NPR like used comics before you kind of came into the picture to communicate some of these topics, or are you kind of just breaking ground within NPR right now?
Oh yeah, that's a great question too. I didn't necessarily give the context for that, but no, there are a couple people before me that have been like really pioneering comics in the newsroom. Specifically, shout out to L.A. Johnson, who's an art director and illustrator on the education team, and then also shout out to Malika Garib, who is, they're both mentors of mine. Malika's on the science team, and they both have done quite extensive like comics work at NPR prior to me coming. And I think, but in terms of others, it's mostly just the three of us. Yeah, I think they were doing it. They were doing it for a couple of years before me, so I think like there was already the space for like making and commissioning comics, and I think like having done that, like some of the folks who like art directors I've seen like an increase in them like commissioning comics from freelancers. And I think with this increase, like there's been an increase with like freelancers pitching comics to us. So it's all been coming upwards recently.
Yeah, I was very surprised at how small you said your team was. For sure, I wouldn't have guessed that. Powerhouse team. So the next question is, actually one just moved up here. You mentioned that some interactives don't seem to generate much interaction. What approaches have you found to be successful to increase user interaction?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think specifically, to be more specific about what I was talking about there, like I think this is often a question with like audio and stories, which is like a huge thing since I work at NPR. Like people want to put audio in stories, and beyond just like on our regular story pages, if it's like a digital piece that goes with like a radio segment. Yeah, it's like a common ask, and we found that like once we do it, people actually don't like listen to it that much, which is unfortunate. And similarly with like another specific example that comes to mind is like adding share buttons to our larger interactive projects. That's like a frequent ask that we'll get, like, can you add a share button to this project to increase engagement? And we found that like when we've done that, like almost nobody is clicking on these share buttons. So I think in terms of like increasing user interactivity, I think part of the question is like what like trying to think about like what brings value to the people that might be reading this, in terms of like, is the interaction that you're doing like have you built it in a way that this interaction is absolutely necessary for the experience, or is it just like kind of a secondary thing? Because we found that actually like if you make interaction absolutely necessary, then maybe sometimes people just won't enter the experience too. So that's why we try to, like on graphics with interactivity, we try not to hide important information behind buttons. Because like honestly, a lot of the times if you look at analytics for our projects, you hope to get like a minute or two of engaged reading on something. Like it's not, people are not spending a long time looking through stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think it's still a question that we ask ourselves to some degree of like, I think the question more often too is that like, how can we make sure people are getting like the crucial information rather than like, I don't know. I think we tend to more ask like, do we need interactivity versus like, how do we make sure people interact? Yeah, because you also run into accessibility issues with adding interactivity to stuff. Like, not everybody has like great data to like look through like a big interactive project on their phone, or like not everybody like is like, perhaps like somebody is using a screen reader to access a project, and like if you've buried something within like 3 layers of interactivity, and like not made that very clear, like that's also an issue.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't really think about the balance between like the short attention span of America right now versus wanting people to actually engage with the data. And then, like you said, making sure that you don't hide things behind buttons. That's actually a really good point. There are other questions floating up here. The next one that's coming up is, are there any educational resources that you would recommend to others interested in DataViz?
Ooh, okay. Let me think. This, I feel like this is not a sponsored post, but like we've started using Data Wrapper for some of our graphics. And this is like something that we pay for. They're like a graphics tooling. They're like a, I'm not saying this correctly. They're like an online graphics tool that makes it super easy to like visualize and make charts. We've started using it more so that we can like teach reporters to make their own charts, and it's like an easier way to do it rather than like teaching them how to code and use our graphics rig. And it's made certain things easier for us as well. But they also have a lot of blog posts about specifically, I mean, they have a lot about how to use their product, but they have a lot too about like, what are the best ways to visualize things? And like, they have specific ones like, I remember I referenced their like color blindness in DataViz article quite frequently. So that's one resource. I would also want to shout out the blog that my team runs, which is apps.mpr.org, I believe is the URL. And we tend to specifically write more like retro blog posts about specific projects that we've done. Like you saw that I referenced the one my coworker wrote about how we built our elections rig. And they're a lot more project focused, but we try to be transparent about like the challenges we faced along the way for different projects and what we've learned. I think those are the two off the top of my head. I think, yeah, I'll just end there. I feel like I could keep going, but.
Awesome, thanks. Maybe we can find looks like C's posting some links in the chat, but maybe we'll send some links out with the recording as well for folks. The next question is, with the review process, how do you identify and avoid implicit biases?
Yeah, that's another great question. I just posted the link to our team blog in the chat. I think like this is a case of like, on some level, like we try to build certain checks into the process to the point where it becomes routine of like, we will always check for stuff like, especially on bigger projects, color blindness, screen reader accessibility, in terms of like accessibility biases that we might be like leaving out. In terms of maybe more editorial biases, I think sometimes this can be difficult because we're often like brought the stories by other folks. So like, I think in a lot of cases, it's like having a good relationship with the people that you work with helps a lot. And being able to talk to them about like, hey, like, I think that like maybe we should think about the words we're using to describe reproductive health in both your article and maybe in like the graphics that we're building for it. And I think like specifically with the team I'm on, like I think that we have this culture where like we'll show each other our work and be like, what do you think of this? And like super open to like making the space for that kind of like critique to happen regularly. Yeah, and I think just like, especially when we're making stuff on deadline, like, I think the best way that like we found to safeguard against this is that there's just so many layers of editing before something goes out into the world here. Like, I'll make something and I'll like, you know, I'll give my own edits to it, and then we have like an editor on our side that'll edit our graphics, and we'll have the editor for the story give their input, and we'll have the editor, like the reporter on the story, give their input. And occasionally, like if it's a larger project, there'll be more than one editor. And if it's like, if it's an issue that we can't reach like a consensus on, we'll tag in some of our standards folks. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of how we actually like do it, just like being intentional about like building in spots for reflection during your process. And like, even though like a lot of times someone's like, we want this by the end of the day, it's like making sure that we have enough space to get something right before we rush it out into the world.
So when you're, if there's like a story that's making representations of like a historically marginalized or underrepresented community, is there work being done like on the editor's side with that community, or like any outreach being done, or any pathways for that within news in general or within NPR?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I think like with specific topics, and like I'm a little less clear on this because I think this is a little bit more towards the reporting side of things, which I do a little bit less of. But to my understanding is that like there is like budget to hire sensitivity readers a lot of the times if people want that for certain projects. I think sometimes there is this practice of like going to specific employee groups within the organization and being like, hey, like writing an article about like trans issues, like you'll have any thoughts? Which, you know, there's sometimes the question of like labor in that answer, in that like process of like, should we be asking these folks to do this kind of work? So I think that's an ongoing conversation. And like, I don't know, I think it's an area for work that a lot of work can be done in. I think a lot of times it comes down to like who's in the room when the decision's being made. And oftentimes I think things will slip by. So we're working on it.
Yeah, and it's not just news. I mean, every sector, right? There's work that needs to be done. Thanks, though, for that. So the next question is, well, you've went through your review process a ton already, so I'll jump down to this question. Could you speak more to your approach of designing for social media, and what do you find works well and gains traction?
Yeah, I can totally do that. This mostly applies to our comics that I make. I think on a certain level, it means knowing that like specifically a lot of the time I'll try to design for Instagram specifically, just because it's like the platform that like you can put 10 images up on a post. And like, therefore, like oftentimes I'll try to work it so that like I'll break the comic out literally into 10 images so that the whole thing can go on Instagram. Because like I think that's such like a valuable way to put like an entire piece of work onto somewhere. Because I think, you know, a lot of times with sharing news onto social media, it's very much a game of like someone will just like look at the headline and be like, great, and that's it. So I think it's valuable that like on Instagram, and to a lesser degree, like I guess Twitter, like you can kind of put the whole thing out there. And also in terms of like, I think this is something that I struggle with making comics for news, that they often have to, like, you have to be pretty clear about like I've talked a little bit about how they're great for like adding nuance to stories, but I think also like to a certain degree, like I feel like there's this real culture of like, you know, sharing like one Instagram infographic or something like that out of context somewhere. And so like knowing that that is a scenario that can happen, right? Like somebody, like oftentimes like how engagement happens is that somebody will just like share a specific panel or things like that. And I don't think that the answer is like making sure that each panel can stand on their own or anything like that, but just like understanding that that is like a common practice that happens, and being mindful of that when putting together something. I think also in terms of like designing for social media is that like frequently people are using their phones for social media, like they're not necessarily on, someone is not necessarily on Instagram on their laptop. So being very conscious of like, we got to make sure the text in there is readable on a phone. It's like, that's like the big thing that like, I think goes into a lot of the shuffling around when I make a comic, is like making sure that there's not too much text on a page, that it's readable on a phone, and that like if we're putting it on somewhere that's outside of NPR, like thinking about accessibility as well, like writing out alternative text for screen readers for each panel, which now you can do on Instagram, as well as Twitter. So also making sure to include that. I mean, we have those on our website too, but like making sure like sending the doc to like our social people and being like, hello, these are the images for the comic, and here is the alt text that you need to put with it for every single panel. Stuff like that.
Awesome. I know that various offices in the USGS and the USGS in general has a Twitter presence. I'm not entirely familiar with our Instagram presence. If we have one, someone let me know if we do, or examples of one. So the last question here that I have, at least on Slido, is how do you choose the data sets and topics to work with?
I'm assuming that this is a question about like my own original reporting, probably, because generally when people we don't have as much of a choice when reporters bring stuff to us. I think for my original reporting, like to be honest, like I work on topics that I'm interested in, and so I actually, because I'm more interested in like pop culture and identity stuff, like I actually tend to do less data focused stories in those areas, just by what I'm interested in. But like, because often like if I want to report on like a specific musician or something like that, there's like, what I'm saying is that I tend to report on areas that don't have great data sets for. And so I think what happens a lot of time is like, that's like half the battle, is like trying to figure out what's out there. And like, once you have some sense of the data, like knowing like A, how reliable is this? How comprehensive is this? How much context does this actually add to like the main question of the story that I'm trying to answer? So an example that I can think of is like, for a while I was like really trying to report this story out about, what was it? Oh, trying to get into like this is so niche, but trying to find data behind like sales for product endorsements for the band BTS. I'm a fan. And there just wasn't really good data out there about like from different companies about like the sort of the main question that we were trying to answer was like, can we quantify like how much their sponsorship, like how much revenue that generates for companies? And there wasn't really like it was a lot of like reaching out to different companies and being like, hey, are you willing to share this data with us? And then being no. And then, you know, sometimes you find stuff that is tangentially related to your question that is like great quality data, but it's not answering the question that you want it to answer. And so you don't use it at all. And other times it's like, sometimes the question then becomes like, actually, the story becomes like, actually, there just isn't great data for this area I'm trying to investigate. And that becomes like the entire story in and of itself. Like reporting about the lack of data can sometimes be like a story that we'll put out. I don't know. That was hopefully what you were trying to ask.
No, I think you hit it right on, for sure. And I see there is a link in the chat to an Instagram account for the USGS Earthquakes Hazards Program. So thanks for putting that in there. I'll check it out. So I think we are coming up on time. So thanks again, Connie, for the great presentation and for sticking around for the Q&A as well. Like I said, we really appreciate your insight and for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us here today. We are going to jump to some general housekeeping items for the group, and you're totally okay to stick around if you want to, but otherwise, you know, feel free to jump off. Don't feel obligated to stick around for our updates. But thanks again. It was very nice meeting you. I hope you have a wonderful week.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. It was great speaking with you all. I think I'm going to log off.
All right. Have a great day.
All right. Bye.
Bye. All right, everyone else, I'm going to help close out today's webinar as well. First and foremost, please feel free to join us on the CDI DataViz Microsoft team. There will be a few links dropped in the webinar chat for you to join us. If you're within the Department of Interior, use the internal link, and if you are a member of the general public or otherwise outside of the department, you can use that external link that Amy just dropped. Once you join, you'll have access to our chat channels that are dedicated to creating and collaborating, networking, and sharing tips and tricks. And then once you've joined us, tell us a little bit about yourself on our meet and greet channel, and then post one of your favorite visualizations. If you'd like, we're always happy to meet new people and to see what everyone's working on. We have recorded today's webinar, and it will be shared through the listserv or the group email. You'll be notified via email and Microsoft Teams when it's ready to go. And then just an FYI, the DataViz Collaboration Area, along with the rest of CDI, we're in the process of migrating from Confluence to SharePoint, and we should have a shiny new SharePoint site live and ready for you all within the coming weeks. And once that site goes live, you'll be able to use it to access past and future webinar information, as well as our various DataViz and community resources. As for next steps, again, we hope to hear from you all via Microsoft Teams. Keep a lookout for the webinar recording coming to you this week, as well as that new SharePoint site within the next few weeks. And then finally, we encourage those of you who are passionate about DataViz and are interested in contributing ideas or feedback to reach out to any one of the planning team members if you'd like to join in our efforts. Our contact information is posted on the old Confluence wiki, which is still live at the moment, and it will be available in the new SharePoint site as well. We're also on Teams. We do welcome your additional perspective and ideas as we plan our quarterly webinars. Right, with that, the organizers and I want to thank everyone for joining today. Again, thanks, Connie. They've dropped off, but thanks for the great presentation and the Q&A session. And like we've done in the past, the planning team will be sticking around for a few minutes to hang out and chat about the content today, what folks are working on, or any ideas for future webinars. So feel free to stick around and unmute or turn on your video if you'd like. We're excited to meet you. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll see you all next quarter.